Hey, it's Emil the composer, and things continue to be busy. I had some other stuff I was working on, and I've been yes, I was going to talk a little bit about form. I was actually thinking one a director Jesse from Fosca Features. I've done some work with him, and he was telling me he's been enjoying these videos. I've got some stuff in the works coming up for him. We haven't really gotten going on yet, which will be fun. So if he lets me, maybe I'll go and I'll talk a little bit about some of that as well at some point when we get underway. But yeah, with the orchestra piece, I think I was talking a little bit about form. I wanted to do kind of a quick discussion on form. I do plan to get set up here with like Finale and Cubase and start actually going through and doing music. And I was also thinking, you can find it on my channel, like just a MIDI mock-up of this string quartet, and it took me like 5 years to write, which was spending a lot of time sitting there simmering in the proverbial closet door, or the proverbial desk drawer. I mean, that's what I meant to say. And it's a piece I'd love to get a performance of at some point, because I'm really pleased with how it turned out. But the conception of it was really interesting, and I think going through it could potentially, that would be probably a series of videos if I could make it as streamlined as possible, so we don't just blabber about it and maybe just look as it develops in stages. I would have to prepare a presentation, I think, and really have everything ready in detail to dig into it, because there's quite a bit that happened. But the long and short of it was that I think I rewrote the thing about 3 times before it was done. And I mean, at the end of it, it was basically just removing the sections I didn't like and then filling them in. But I think it was watching me struggle with this that led Christos to show me a method for writing. And I kind of want to discuss a little bit about form and about methods in form. And I think like this sort of info that I got on creating music and writing through forms and whatnot when I started composition, we talked, one piece of advice I'd heard is write your different like sketches or ideas for different textures, different sections, and kind of work on those and then write and stitch everything together, which I got fairly adept at doing, and I've written quite a few pieces like before, graduating. I did quite a number of pieces that way, and I think it would they turned out for the most part. But the interesting thing was, like, a lot of times there's this whole idea of planning things out. Beethoven did this, planning things out ahead of time, having a plan, having like pre-composition, having predetermined containers for music. I mean, our form is a container. We do a lot of analysis of form in university. We talk about like sonata allegro form as an example of that, rondo, like classical forms that are common. Talk about an A, B, and then A plus B form, which is actually serendipitously how the string quartet had turned out. And I think I mentioned a little bit about, say, slow fast. That's another common one. When I was working on the quartet, I'd written this piece as an audition piece that I called The Great Experiment. And it was a great experiment because I'd never written a chamber piece for strings before, and I didn't know what I was doing, and I didn't know how it was going to turn out. There's all these sort of nasty, idiomatic things with my writing that I couldn't, if I was to redo it, it would have turned out way differently. And I think the journey, the string quartet that I'm referencing here that I wrote in my doctorate, was my attempt at rewriting The Great Experiment, and rewriting it from the form is the same, more or less, and that's really, there's that, and the sort of vibe of it is the same, but like all the material's new. But it was just, how would I write this piece if I was to rewrite it? And I'm talking a lot about it because I think that piece turned out this way, where it was sketches that ended up getting written together. And there was a big sort of unfolding that happened with it. And I had a sketch. There's the beginning, like it's roughly slow fast, and it's the beginning of the fast section is really what the original sketch was. Then the very ending was the next sketch. And I was really getting into like listening to a lot of metalcore at the time, and I was really interested in the whole juxtaposition in like a metal and metalcore where you have clean singing versus harsh vocal, and the idea of, I mean, the band Extol does this too, where you'll have really grinding, more dissonant sections of music which are juxtaposed and given relief in terms of like by becoming a lot more tonal. And I'd written some music trying to capture that kind of aggression, and what I did was I would add complexity to chords, i.e. dissonance, as the dynamic level went up, and as the dynamic level went down, I'd remove it, which is really the same as playing a guitar and adding it adds distortion as you play heavier. Basically, the more you push the preamp, the more it starts to clip, and that's sort of an expressive thing with guitar, and I think I was trying to emulate that in a way. But that piece was largely written, was very sectional as well, and I think something that was characterized by that in my own process was you end up with a proliferation of rewrites. And I had this, what's the word? There's this dichotomy in my process right now, because what Christos told me to do when writing music, and a lot of people talk about, what do we start with? Do we start with a part, and then do we add layers on top? It's like baking some sort of cake or something, a dessert, where we, like a trifle, a layer, then layer, then layer, then layer, then layer of material. Or is it that we create sketches of sections, make a sectionalized form, and then we write everything together? I actually had a song that was called Anorexic. It was a setting of a poem by a poet named Evan Boland, and that was highly sectionalized piece of music that was written in sections, where I wrote it together and I got it to sound like everything worked. So there was that. There's the layered approach. You hear this a lot more in video game music, where it's like, let's create it, like this whole idea of repetitive, like a repetitive ostinato, or like this layered, stratified approach to texture, where we build parts on top of parts. I mean, that works when you're writing with live instruments and you're doing an arrangement and you're trying sort of to imagine what you're going to do and tracking everything, and you kind of do your bass, and then you keep adding to it. That's a big thing. I generally find, though, when I'm doing music in that style, like I can do that to a point, but oftentimes I can imagine ahead of time what I want because of my work with concert music. So my tools that I have are a lot more than maybe what a lot of people would have when they were writing music. It's like you have people that are composers, oh, I do chiptune. And that's always funny when people who write chiptune, they just layer it with density because they don't know counterpoint. And my advice to anybody, if you want to be good at chiptune, study counterpoint and study it and study it and study it. Don't learn the rules, learn the concepts. So I could have a whole discussion on theory on this, which I might do. I think that's what I'll do next. I'll do maybe a basic what is music theory video. We won't be studying music theory, but we'll be studying how it applies to composition. I'm actually thinking of doing a set of lessons on basic composition as well, because I've been teaching composition and I've been thinking a lot about it, the way I learned versus the way that I'm thinking about it now that I've been writing in all the different genres I've written in. But getting back to form, so we talked about like this sort of, it's like the clubhouse sandwich piece or this trifle piece. And then there's this idea of let's kind of work in sections and stitch it all together. And then there's Christos' idea. He says, each piece is a backpacking journey. So what he would suggest to do is get your intro down, get all your material together that you want to write, and once you get your start ready, start and write from the start without break to the finish. And I found the reason why I didn't like writing like that in my undergrad. That's what I tried to do. The Great Experiment was written that way, and that's what I tried to do initially, but I found I would reach a point when I didn't know what came next. And I was given the advice, well, write the ending, then you know what comes next. And I found that to be helpful to do that. But the thing that's really interesting is my music was, the harmonies were not functional on a structural level for the longest time, because the music, the pedagogical environment and aesthetic expectations were such that anything that was more centered in that way was not really seen. It was kind of a faux pas, and I would get around that by just being absolutely bonkers with the modulating. And it's just like the whole idea of like taking Shostakovich or Prokofiev a step further in terms of root motion, where it's like, let's just move everywhere all the time, and we're going to give the impression that we're never really centered in the music. And it was kind of this haphazard throwing things at the wall to see what sticks approach to handling harmony, as it wasn't really, the harmony wasn't really structural, so it didn't largely matter. I mean, I would even go so far as to transposing ideas to kind of, it's like, okay, that's getting boring in harmony, let's just do some sort of common tone modulation, or just go even further, smooth it out with the voice leading just for the sake of getting to the next section, but trying to keep throwing cold water on people to keep them interested. That was sort of a strategy I was using. And I think when I was doing my doctorate, and my score reading has improved. I didn't know how to read music when I started my undergrad, and my score reading has improved considerably since then. And it was actually Christo's advice that I don't do work outside of music, that everything I do is music related in some way. And I think it was teaching guitar and teaching cello and teaching guitar and teaching cello largely, where I was reading sheets, because I want to teach my students how to read, and I want to teach them how to play by ear. And they always kind of, they're stubborn in the area that they struggle, but that's every student. But yeah, when I really was learning how to score read, not only that, but I was beginning to really understand and imagine music in my mind a lot more. It's like before, when I was writing, I would try things, I would see if they would work, and I would sort of project it and just throw stuff down, and if it sounded good, great, and then I would kind of edit it to make it sound good. And that's, I think, why there was so much editing happening. But as I was saying, you get to be to a point where I can begin to imagine large-scale harmonic structures a lot more easily in my writing. And I mean, that was something I think I really, I mean, I'm continually working on it, but I think I really dialed it in during my doctorate, particularly my thesis, Wings, which I have an archival recording that I can't post. I'm sorry, I can't post it, but I signed a contract when they did the reading, and I'm really hoping that when we get this orchestra piece, the current one, together, that maybe that would be able to be something that could be recorded as well, so people could hear it. But I really created like the pace of the root motion, and the sort of distance that the harmonies are moving was something that I used as one of the parameters that I was balancing in the piece. And I mean, I really did try to accomplish a couple of intellectual things through the process of writing the piece, largely because it is a thesis and I have to be able to make a case for myself as a composer. But that was a piece I started at the beginning and I wrote through until the end. And the rewrites were fast and they were minimal. And I wrote the piece Hidden Garden, which is it's a piece for one of my students, one of my cello students. And the piece is, I kind of wrote that at the beginning and wrote it through until the end, but it was, it was I'm going to compose this in a sitting kind of a project, and I kind of cheated on it later. I went back a couple of days and did some rewrites and cleaned it up and made it just really flow incredibly well, but I kind of cheated in that it was a sonata form, and I went and I just kind of copied out the material I used earlier on, which is, I mean, largely the point of a recapitulation is a variation on an exposition. So that was kind of what my process was using a, roughly speaking, a sonata form for it. I wanted something that my students could even use on exams, that the conservatory would be okay with, and I'm going to run it by them and find out. That was front to back. But then I worked on this oboe and piano piece, and the material was not cooperating, and it was frustrating, and I ended up having to do what I did with the string quartet. I did rewrite after rewrite, then I deleted sections and wrote sections together, and I think I've got it where I want it now. I did a lot of work. I did a lot of textural thinning and just changing I changed a lot of little details and a lot of not little details, and it was, again, it was like there was these moments that were just great, but somehow the material was not easy to work with. So I think I've generally tried to use the system of starting at the beginning and working through, because it allows me, when I do that, the ideas come about in a more natural way, which results in far less editing for the most part. And I think that's been the thing that I've really, really appreciated about that as a process, which is, let's skip the steps and kind of work through it as a process, of the whole composition as a process. And I don't do a lot of pre-composition when I write. I mean, well, it's not entirely fair. When I was working on a film for Jesse, it was Lucica, and I mean, I'm gonna have to definitely, maybe I'll have to do some commenting or do a video on it once he's officially released it, and it would be interesting to talk about that, because then I did a lot of pre-composition. There was a ton of pre-composition for the film work. And well, anyway, I think all the skills that I learned writing in all the various ways was actually a really good thing, because then I'm able to puzzle my way out of a problem area, and I'm able to make things work, and I'm able to stack things up when I write music and write layer after layer. I'm able to write in like sketches in a way, and work them together so they sound like they flow together. And I'm able to start at the beginning and work through a piece, and I'm able to have control of the harmonies I'm using and the textures I'm using. And I think overall, all the stages of the development were incredibly important to my development as a composer. I think they're all valuable things to learn how to do, because you're going to need those skills. I mean, sometimes you're writing at the beginning of a piece and working through until the end of the piece, and you just happen to have a gap because something you wrote didn't work and it needs to go out, and everything's in place narratively, except then you've got a spot that you need to work through. I mean, this just happens in the process. It's part of the craft. So I think all that's important. Largely with this particular commission, I do intend on starting at the beginning and then working through the piece. That's what I did with my youth orchestra piece. It's called A Love Letter to My Wife, and my sort of portable recorder wasn't working, and we're trying to track down an archival recording of that piece. And so it's like, tragically, I've got quite a bit of music that I haven't actually got a good sort of performance and recording of, and it's been disappointing, because there's a lot of things that I would like to include in videos as examples for people. I do want to get more into the actual nuts and bolts of the process, and as we move forward, it's going to become less conceptual and more focused. I mean, the piece I'm planning on running, I've gotten so far where I really want to experiment with some like percussion textures, and I really want to experiment with using the harp and creating a sense of snow falling. I think I talked about that. And then I haven't determined what I'm going to do for the fast part of the piece yet. I haven't really got that far. There's been a lot of other things that have been going on that I've been thinking about, but I've been sort of just letting this percolate, and I'm going to get to it in a bigger way. But I just really wanted to talk a little bit about the conception and the process of form. I mean, texture is form, and is part of form, and harmony is part of form, and melody is part of form, and larger hypermeter and phrase structures are all part of form, and largely this ebb and flow of material. I mean, I suppose it sounds like I'm wrapping things up, and then the next thing I'm thinking about talking about is structure, like throughcomposed versus like sectionalized form. I mean, some basic examples is looking up Stravinsky Rite of Spring. That's a very sectionalized form. A piece I wrote, Winter, and I think it's up on my YouTube channel. I'm pretty sure. I made a demo. I've been making demos. I just kind of sequence the piano part, and my friends play the solo part, and at least people can hear the music. But that one's Throughcomposed. I start at the beginning and work my way through until the end, and that was my attempt at Snow Falling, which is what kind of I wanted to do an arrangement of it using Super Nintendo sounds, and then the piano part was too rangy to work with the harp, because those sampled sounds are just so narrow. Oh yeah, I was talking a little bit about different genres of composition, but no, we should go through forms. So the whole idea of like sectionalized and structured forms, and I mean structured in that there's a roadmap. And people will draw out, some composers will draw out roadmaps to plan out their forms in the exact sort of length and when here's an event and they don't know what the event is, but they kind of plan it out anyway. So they have their plot and their narrative down ahead of time. So there's that. And then there's this whole idea of like these sectional or structured forms. The string quartet turned into that, and I think it had to, because it was largely, I was writing sketches together. There's a big story on how that came to be, but yeah, and I think the Throughcomposed form is really interesting. And it's not that you're not going to restate material, it's not that you're not going to develop material, it's not that there's not going to be a cohesive form that can be analyzed after the piece is done. I think there really is a lot of times, but I think when I say Throughcomposed, I mean, that can be used to refer to a certain type of formal structure, but in this case, it's more a process, I think. You know, because some composers rely so heavily on precomposition, they go so far as to precompose their harmonic material and their motives and their melodies and everything, really kind of controlling, and then their music ends up structured in a certain way. And then sometimes some of us just like, I don't feel the need to do that. The music happens as it happens as I'm writing it, and I have ideas, and I don't need to worry about planning, although it bites me when I have to go back and rewrite pieces. But there's a lot we could talk about in terms of approaches and genres. Maybe I should do a video on genres rather than just doing this. So maybe we should say that this is the end of this topic, and then I'll just jump right in and I'll talk just briefly about genres. I guess I'll mention this as a short sort of coda, and I'll just kind of give my brief thoughts on it, and then we'll wrap this up rather than doing a big long discussion. I think Christos was always saying that people were like, he said that we're dissociative identity disorder suffering artists, and he wasn't saying that our personalities were that, but he was saying our muse or sort of creative persona, with multiple creative personas, and that was what was disassociative about our writing. And his sort of comment is people have like their academic side, their academic music they show their friends, and they have their personal music they play for themselves, and often they'll be doing like rock on the side. So they've got like these several different fragments of this pie. I don't know, as a composer, it's hard to say where I fall into that right now. But Christo's opinion was always stitch everything together into one hat and wear it proudly. Be unified as a creator and draw on all your influences. Draw on all your influences. His comment was, "You listen to Ligeti. Ligeti is a part of you now." Because a lot of composition students would be a little bit put off by modernist composers. I mean, I was too. I don't know, I really enjoy those sort of concerts now, just because it's different, just because it's novel, and it's fun to listen to because it's novel. But anyway, yeah, so genre. I wanted to talk about genre a little bit, just because of the fact there have been some Twitter arguments going on about this, and people getting worked up about things that they shouldn't get worked up about. I mean, I think there's a lot of sort of, we can use art, like visual or drawing, or like visual art as a metaphor for music. And I think or I like to talk about it in terms of cooking as well. Let's just say art. So you have like pencil art, there's digital art, pixel art, watercolor paintings, oil paintings. And I think largely creating music is like this too. Because there's people, and they specialize in many different things. You have some people that specialize in video game music. And I made the argument in a paper years ago now. And I mean, things have changed since then. But my argument was the whole idea of video game music was the aesthetic that results from using digital instruments. And the thing that makes the aesthetic the way it is. Digital instruments don't have the same acoustic properties as live instruments do, especially when they're playing together. For instance, if you have an orchestra and you go and you write a flute solo in the lowest register and you're writing forte in the brass, you're not going to hear the flute no matter how much you tell the flute player to turn up. It won't happen. It just physically can't. And then there's lines, there's certain things that can't be played on some instruments. They just don't work. So it's like it sounds really good when you make a mock-up of the recording. You think these notes are awesome. I wouldn't do anything different for note selection. And then it's like the player can't play the note selection, so then the part that you played isn't even heard. Therefore, the part doesn't sound good because they can't play it the way that it's written. It's just that sort of thing, or like balance issues, and that's just an example of that. So, I mean, there's an elitism among people, like typically among people of my background, and I don't think younger people my age and younger are necessarily that way, but in general, it's something that you encounter in the academy, which is, I think, maybe why it's become a bit of a contentious thing among video game composers. But this idea is like, I'm a real composer because I know how to write for real orchestra. Well, I'm an orchestral composer, and I'm a concert music composer. That's what that means. It's a different genre. So yeah, I think that, I think that's a cool thing. I think that's a cool thing when it's like doing watercolor. It's a perfect example of watercolor, let's say, versus pixel art, where it's like certain brush strokes you have to kind of commit to what you're doing with the color to a certain degree, and it's hard to paint over things, and it's kind of similar to live orchestra in that way versus pixel art, where you can just keep iterating it, and you can really cover up any sort of thing that happens that you don't like. You don't have to try to hide your mistake. You just can literally remove it. It's not a mistake. It's part of the iteration. It's kind of like that sort of thing, which I think is really cool. And you can go back and you can actually tweak your final product. You're not having to commit to something when it's recorded. It's like recorded and printed and it's done, and you can't really go back, or the performance is over and you can't really go back and change it unless you have another crack at it. You don't even know what your writing is going to sound in the space with the real orchestra, because you can't know that really until you hear it. So I think the fact that digital writing is different, I think the outcome is different, and I think really it's a genre in and of itself, and it sounds like a genre. Digital orchestration in that style, orchestral game music, sounds like a genre, and I think that's really cool. It's kind of like, it's like these blending with like the pixel, sorry, that pixel. I'm thinking old school, and my brain's getting tired. But the chip tune, the PCM, the chip tune stuff is its own thing. I mentioned that again about counterpoint. Well, that's a massive advantage, especially if you want to write the sort of period specific music. I'm doing 4 channels, and you basically have it like a woodwind trio with a drummer. Like, I mean, that's kind of what it is, and you can't fake having your clarinet play a chord of a full rendered's the wrong word. I'm trying to think how to put this, and I think everybody would understand. You can only have a clarinet play one pitch or one note at a time. It's a monophonic instrument, and they talk about multifonics. Multifonics are an effect. It doesn't sound like a multiphonic can't make one clarinet sound like 4 clarinets, and I guess that's what I'm trying to distinguish here. I'm saying that, in PCM, you don't get like square and triangle waves. You don't get a multiphonic as well. You get a sound in the same way, and it's very much like it's like writing a woodwind trio of something. It's like 2 clarinets and a bassoon, or maybe 2 oboes. 2 oboes and a bass clarinet would be more similar to what the timbres are. That with a drummer. So that's kind of a genre as well, and it's different. And there's different rules that apply, because it's like, okay, the idiomatic limitations of this are so different than what you would encounter writing for live players. The limitations of the idiom are what the idiom isn't able to render. And I mean, digital orchestral writings like this too. The general rule is pick the range and the notes in your library that sound the most realistic, to try to hide from the limitations of the library, which is so backwards, because when you're writing for live orchestra, you have to say, I don't care if this sounds bad, I have to imagine that it's something players can play, and hopefully I know enough players who can go through and help with that and kind of smooth those things out. But then we're talking, yeah, pop music. That's another, I was talking a little bit about stratified writing with genre. I'm like, okay, I'm gonna write a melody with changes, and then I'm gonna do a bed track with an acoustic guitar, and that kind of gives me the form, it gives me the intro, right, the little hook that goes with it, it gives me the verse, chorus, bridge, chorus, whatever the structure is. And then I go from there, and what you're doing is you track the drums and the bass, and then after that you go and you write out and you do all your other parts, all your rhythm parts, and you're orchestrating step by step as you're going. You kind of go back and re-record if it doesn't work. And I had this happen. I wrote a piece for the Scott Craker band. I don't know if they're watching this. I don't know if they'd be interested, but yeah, and it was 2 guitars, and it had some cool changes and some cool textures, but it was like a pizza crust, uncooked pizza crust or whatever. And I went and I wrote piano and cello, and I kind of wrote out all the piano stuff I wanted, and then I went out after that and I wrote all the cello stuff I wanted. I kind of thought what I wanted to do in my head, and I had the space, and I stuck it together as I went. Or the other stuff you can find on Marcus of Roxley, his channel. We've done a few, I think we've done 4 releases together, and the latest one we released called Thing, it's from the concept album Barter. And I mean, largely what was mostly working for him was like his guitar riffs and his sort of formal concept generally lands really well. And then I find I end up going back, and he did a lot of band stuff where they had like the harsh vocal. Now he's wanting to work with clean vocal, and I'm having to go and reset the text. So I found even with that it was kind of stratified, where it's like, here's the guitar riff, then we're going to structure a bass part around that, and we're going to go and we take the changes and we're writing vocal melodies. Okay, I've got vocal melodies, we need lead part. There's an alternation roughly happening between call and response with vocal parts and lead guitar, where before the lead guitar was in the spot the vocal melody should have been, and then I kind of flipped it. So I had to go and use the same ideas, but then I actually used the counterpoint in finale to go and write out those lead lines. So there was that, and writing out the bass line. I don't know if I mentioned that, but writing out a bass line for it. And I had to actually change I ended up changing the solo section, because we had actually written out the form for this thing together way back when I first moved back to Winnipeg. We were planning on starting a metal band together, which is actually our metal band has turned into this studio project. But anyway, yeah, I went back and I'm like, there's something missing. So I went and I tracked a keyboard using a harpsichord sound. I used the piano, it didn't work, and I tracked the harpsichord over. So that was kind of, yeah, so sort of that's endemic to that genre, this whole idea of rock music, where it's a lot more stratified in the approach, largely because of the fact that if you're writing, you're kind of recording on an instrument at a time. And it's just the process sort of leads to the sound. The tools affect the sound. And that's the thing that I'm trying to drive home about this. Like, I've done some stuff with Super Nintendo sounds too, and I find that then the Super Nintendo writing is layered in this way too, largely because it was a bunch of separate monophonic tracks, and this was the limitations of the hardware, and that's what made the sound of the music. So I don't like the idea of elitism with composition. I don't like the idea that live instruments are good or bad. Live instruments are expressive. If you want something to sound realistic, and you don't have a big budget, you're going to put live instruments for everywhere you can, all the solos. That really makes a big difference. Then you can sweeten up the rhythm tracks a bit by having a player track each line and kind of blending that, and that, or having 3 takes and blending that makes a big difference too. So I mean, if you're trying to write orchestral music that you want people to mistaken for an actual, like you want people to mistaken for live players playing, then you need to know how an orchestra actually works, and you need to know how to set up a score and how to read a score, so you can go and you can study the different textures that are happening and understand truly how how the ensemble works and how composers are kind of coming up with the sort of effects that they are, the colors that they are with the orchestra. So I think in that sense, well, yeah, you better have an idea what you're doing or you're going to have a lot of trouble having it turn out. It was like I was listening to the music for this really cool indie game, The Companion. I mean, shout out again to Hugh. It was really evocative. It was a nice evocative track, but the impression I had was like the way it sounded was like he was playing out his piano ideas on the piano and recording it and cleaning it in MIDI. Then he was going and playing out the string melodies and then the accompanying strings on a piano. That was kind of how it sounded. And I mean, that's not neither here nor there, but my ear as a composer, I go into that and I think to myself, I would love to take these ideas and then go and actually write it the way I would approach it with my understanding with strings, which is each part has an individual line or individual two parts if there's divisio or whatever, and actually write it using counterpoint. I find orchestral music is highly contrapuntal, and anybody who wants to imitate the ensemble definitely study counterpoint in great detail and study it conceptually, same way I say for chip music. But that being said, the thing is, the music would be different. If I was to score a game like that, it would be different. And I mean, we can apply a value judgment or we can not apply a value judgment, and in the end it's like the flavors are different. So what's necessary? What do people want? So I don't really like the idea of elitism in writing, and I think digital composition is cool and it's a genre and it's good for what it is and people enjoy it. I mean, what is it? For what it is. It sounds like I'm dismissing it. I'm not saying that. I'm saying what it is more just as a descriptor, as an observation. Like, you listen to it knowing what you're listening to. It's like you don't order spaghetti and expect to get lasagna. That's what I'm saying. You just enjoy spaghetti. Spaghetti will always be spaghetti, and digital orchestra will be that for the most part, unless it's somebody who's experienced with the different genre and a different process, who's trying to emulate that process, and that's a different thing. Yeah, I definitely think, I mean, there's a lot more. We could get into chamber music, and we could get into, like, I don't really do a lot of electronica stuff. I did a chiptune techno thing, and I've done atmospheric compositions because we did textural stuff, and I did experimental improvising, so I could do that, like musique concrète kind of thing. I haven't done that in a long time, but I'm familiar with all of these things, and I've done that too, like manipulating wave files and creating soundscapes and stuff, and that's pretty fun. But I'm not really equipped to get into like EDM style stuff. I have not really. I'm sure with my chops and my understanding of composition, that I've no doubt I'd be able to create a piece of art in that idiom that would hold up under scrutiny, not in terms of aesthetic, but in terms of compositional integrity, which is maybe something to do at some point. But I think it was more just with genre. It's just this attitude of, like, I was showing this soundtrack. I really love this soundtrack for I think they called it Trials of Mana for the North American release, but we knew it as we would badly pronounce the Japanese. We call it Seiken Densetsu 3. We'd badly pronounce the Japanese name of the game, and I was showing this to some of my friends. So I was sort of getting into writing video game music influenced concert music, and it's like, what is this MIDI crap? And use a different word than that. And I was thinking, well, that's not the point. It's like people in that community look at MIDI playback not as being, it can't be an art form. It has to be a mock-up. It has to be the prototype for the final piece. This isn't art yet, because this is the sounds that we use to proofread what we're doing, and they don't understand how that can be an aesthetic that people enjoy, which I really think they do. So I guess that was more where I was going with the aesthetic end of things. And I mean, just talking a little bit about the sort of stratified approach to writing with pop music, and then digital composition, and then obviously using a DAW, using Cubase for it, and writing out, recording parts with a MIDI piano is a great way to kind of quickly move that sort of thing, versus what you do with concert music and going and using notation software. I find it challenging to export from notation software into Cubase because there's a lot of finagling just to get everything to the instruments to play, the digital instruments to play correctly. But if I'm working in a film and I'm working on a very, very difficult or sort of involved orchestral cue, if I'm getting buried using digital software, I will default back to Finale because I just find it works better. But yeah, generally my approach, my sort of thoughts are write on an instrument. If you have ideas, write on the instrument, record yourself playing, layer it. That's one thing. Or play around in your DAW and work in your DAW using digital instruments and just pull together your piece that way. Write on manuscript, like on staff paper, or write in Finale. And I would say to people, don't say, this is my process and stick to it. It's never a good way to create. The best way to create is, I'm going to try as many different processes as possible because each time I try that, I'm going to learn something. And I'm going to be better for it. It's going to come back to benefit me long term. Anyway, that's a lot of just thoughts. I mean, it occurred to me I would talk like this to people, and then I realized I'm actually composing when I talk this way, because that's what composing is. It's a free association of associated ideas that flow from one to the next. So I'm writing music and more than communicating information in some way. But I'm going to wrap this up and call it. I don't know if I don't know how to do this in YouTube yet, but I should almost be time stamping or labeling this or whatever. Just when we started talking a little bit, it was more just the Gronder thing turned into just grinding the axe about all the people screeching away about digital music versus live instruments. If you want live instruments and you want it to sound that way and that's all that will do, I mean, record. Book a recording orchestra and record. Get the money together and do it. I mean, that's the sound. But anyway, we'll wrap up here, and I think maybe next time we'll just talk about what theory is conceptually. I think that would be an interesting conversation because that kind of gets in. That's part wrapped up in the conception process, starting to come through music, and then I think that covers just about everything for the conception end of things, and then I think we'll move into starting to do some sketches after that. Thank you all for tuning in, and have a great rest of your day.